Okay. So that's for you. Crystal, this is ready. Well, I'm going to get the meeting started. Thank you all for coming out. It's nice. I could talk loud.
I mean, I can talk loud too, but for recording, I guess. purposes.
I'm Jean Pillow, and I'm a longtime member of the Woodstock Conservation Commission. And our Pollinator Pathway Initiative is in our third year. But this is the first time we've been able to have a live presentation rather than over Zoom. So celebrate that, if you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pollinator Pathway Initiative, why we're doing it. Okay, that's not advancing my slide. All right, we have a plan of open space and conservation in our town. Open space and conservation is a plan that we wrote to, try to develop a plan for how we want the town to stay rural while we're developing. And so this is, there's different open space in different parts of Woodstock. A lot of open space exists in town. Not all of it is committed, permanent open space. A lot of it is private property and can change over time. We also have significant areas of development in between those open spaces. And we don't want to create habitat islands in our little open spaces that are separated. So Pollinator Pathway is an initiative to connect those open spaces by people voluntarily participating in the program by planting pollinator habitat on their property. So we have a Greenways initiative, which is one of the early things we did on the commission in 2006. We're working with our neighbors. There's a Little River Greenway that includes Woodstock and Putnam, and there's a Natchog River Greenway system that includes Woodstock, Eastford, Chaplin, Ashford, Mansfield, a whole bunch of towns, because we believe that creating open spaces that are connected is important. And so we have intermunicipal cooperation already. So the Pollinator Pathway is a different kind of greenway. Again, it involves voluntary participation for people who are willing to put pollinator habitat and abide by certain restrictions that voluntarily, again, we're not telling anybody they have to do it. It's a way to create connections between those committed open spaces using your property as a point along the way. And to join the Pollinator Pathway Initiative and to earn one of our medallions that we're providing to town residents, we're asking you to rethink your lawn, because actually lawns are kind of a barren wasteland when it comes to supporting our pollinators and other wildlife. Incorporate native plants, shrubs, and trees in your yard, because that is what the native insects are accustomed to eating. And if you only have exotic species from other places, you're not going to feed the caterpillars that become the butterflies. You're not going to be feeding moths that are important pollinators as well. And you're also going to break an important link in the food chain for birds that rely on caterpillars as a food resource for their young in the summer. We ask that you reduce the use of fertilizers in your lawn, and by planting pollinator gardens, you are not as reliant on using fertilizers, because native plants do not have the same needs for maintenance. They don't require fertilization. They're accustomed to living under the conditions naturally. And we also ask you to avoid the use of pesticides. This includes herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, because those things are harmful to the pollinator species that we're trying to promote. And if you're willing to do all those things and sign a pledge that you're willing to do all those things, we'll put your address on the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway. Lydia, you wrote me a wonderful introduction and I left it across the room.
Well, I don't know if Jean should even bother to introduce me because she's given my talk in a nutshell. And one thing, I guess maybe while she's looking for it, I got it. Oh, okay. I hope I'm not going to be preaching to the choir. She asked me to come and talk about why plant native plants and then tell you a little bit about the organization that I'm mostly involved with. That's kind of become my retirement job, as it were. Well, I'll let you, Jean,
Okay.
tell you a little bit more how I got into this place.
This is great. Lydia is president and program co-chair of Wild Ones Mountain Laurel chapter. She's a retired pharmaceutical industry scientist turned environmental steward with a focus on sustaining biodiversity. She holds a BS in biology from Yale and a PhD in biological sciences from UC San Diego. Her professional career included more than 20 years of research on musculoskeletal diseases and 7 years in science and public health policy. She became a convert to gardening with native plants after reading Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home book and enjoys the challenge of growing from seed. For the past 3 years, she has led volunteers to replace invasive plants with native species to improve wildlife habitat at Coogan Farm. Is that in Stonington? I think I just unplugged the speaker. Okay.
I think, yeah, I think we both can project. This is a small room. Oh, let me turn this thing off.
So she does some wildlife habitat at Coogan Farm. She joined Wild Ones in 2014 and became chapter president in 2019. She's also a volunteer docent with the Connecticut College Arboretum and a member of the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group. She was appointed to the board of the Eastern Connecticut Conservation District, that's where I work, as an alternate director in 2020. So I'm really pleased to have her here for more than one reason. In addition to native plants, Lydia grows vegetables and orchids and tends a small menagerie of geriatric serpents. You know that you like that one. She lives in Mystic with her husband, Mark, also a retired scientist who shares many of her interests. So join me in welcoming Lydia to Woodstock.
Thank you, Jean. That was a very kind introduction from you, and I'm very happy to be here. And are you already recording or?
It's recording, yes.
Okay. So, I guess, let me just get myself set up here. Yeah, as I said, Jean asked me to come tell you about the importance of native plants in your garden, what they will do for not only your garden and the pollinator pathway, but biodiversity and kind of the health of our environment in general. As I say, I hope I'm not preaching to the choir. I'll try to go pretty quickly, and I'm happy to stay for questions after the meeting. So it might be simplest. I don't know how you normally want to handle the questions, but if we hold them to the end if possible,
Your preference.
I'll try to march through as quickly as I can. So go ahead, second slide. So I think the first question to answer that sounds like not everybody here knows is Wild Ones is a national 501c3 organization that is really devoted to native plants. Our mission is to promote environmentally sound landscaping practices and preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. And I will be telling you why our focus on native plants, that we really feel that that's the linchpin of the whole process. Next slide. As Doug Tallamy says, we are nature's best hope. We must plant native plants in our landscapes to regenerate biodiversity and restore ecosystem function. And to quote from one of Doug's books, he says, in the past, we have asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to support life, all life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. And Doug, for those of you, I don't know that he's become exactly a household name, but certainly in the native plant community, he is one of our most ardent spokespeople. And I'm really pleased to be able to say he is a lifetime honorary director of Wild Ones. He's been associated with the organization for quite a long time. And I am very pleased that he's also such an eminent scientist, and he really backs up what he writes about and shares his scientific findings that really are underpin all of what I'll be talking about. And I will actually be showing you some of his findings. So to kind of start with the basics, what in fact are we talking about as when we say native plant? And there are a couple of common definitions that float around. An old definition that is kind of falling out of favor is that native plants were those that were present before European colonization. That's a kind of description that's a definition that's usually pretty correct. But I think it's more important that we see a native plant is one that is really part of our ecosystem, part of the balance of nature. It has complex connections with many, many other living things, plant and animal in our environment, and is part of that tapestry. And those are things that evolved over a long period of time to make it a functional component of the ecosystem. Native, of course, implies a geographic qualifier. For example, we really should say, I mean, when we're with each other, we understand each other to mean native to New England or native to the Northeast US. Obviously, if you live in California, native means a different thing to you. Or if you live, in Brazil. But, what is native to one place is not native to another. And also, we tend to talk now in terms of ecoregions. Whoops.
Where did you?
Before, there we are. So ecoregions is more relevant to this understanding of functional ecosystems. It's a little bit more, it's another way of designating areas that have similar types, quantities, and qualities of environmental resources. So it's a kind of a richer classification scheme than USDA hardiness zones, which are really based primarily on temperature, phosphates, et cetera. This system of ecoregions, which has kind of 4 levels of similarity, with one being the broadest brush stroke, and then as you hone in on smaller and smaller locales, you look at those finer similarities between regions, and that include factors like the geology, the topography, the terrain, the amount and type of precipitation that falls on a place, even the types of vegetation, forest, field, marsh, etc. So these are all features that help categorize things. And so our ecoregion at the level 3 is what you can hopefully see pretty well on this map. So our ecoregion goes all the way to from the New York border on Long Island Sound up to the southern coastal region of Maine, most of Connecticut, except for the Litchfield Hills, which have more in common with the Berkshires than they do with our coastal region. And so growing plants, so the types of plants found in this ecoregion are pretty similar throughout, and they're pretty ecologically functional throughout our region. Next. So a non-native plant, obviously, is everything that's not a native plant, but more specifically, it's a plant that was introduced to a location, generally by humans, whether intentionally or accidentally. Synonyms are alien, exotic, introduced. Some non-native plants are actually naturalized in our landscape, so some of us may think they belong here. So plants like Queen Anne's lace or an English daisy or dandelions, white clover. These are actually not native plants, but they've been here so long and they've managed to reproduce themselves so that without our help, they can maintain a self-sustaining population. However, that does not necessarily mean they do a lot for the ecosystem. They've managed to survive, but they generally have not formed really strong connections with many of the other organisms in the ecosystem. And we'll come back to that because you may be saying now, but the bees visit the dandelions and the bees use, well, we'll talk about bees. There are bees and then there are bees. There are native bees. And finally, there's a subset of non-native plants that we really don't want to have around. And these are the ones that have naturalized and have become bullies and pests. These are the ones that we classify as invasive because they are, let's see, you need to advance.
Sorry.
These are invasive because they literally crowd out the native plants or any other plants that may be growing in an area. And in doing so, in forming this monoculture of of monopolizing a piece of land, they can change the soil chemistry and really disrupt the normal nature that was there before. And in doing so, you get almost kind of a domino effect that not only are they, displacing native plants, but then all of the pollinators, other animals, and even plants that depend on other plants, you can see all of this system gets disrupted. And consequently, they really are a major threat to biodiversity and to the health of our ecosystems. Next slide. Okay, so this is probably a kind of familiar picture that many of us have seen, the satellite image of the lights in the nighttime sky, and pretty much shows us where people live in the US. And you can see grossly that the eastern half of the country is more populous than the western half. Well, it turns out the eastern half is actually more biodiverse. There are more different kinds of habitats and species in the east than in the west. And I don't know, maybe for some of the same reasons, we've decided we like to live here. And there's more people here. In fact, one of the challenges that I think Jean may have alluded to, or at least I know we were talking about over dinner, is that the vast majority, in fact, almost 90% of the land east of the Mississippi is in private hands, it's under private ownership. And that makes a challenge for managing land use because it's up to the owner what they do with their land, as long as they're not breaking laws. So I think by that token, it's another reason that we as private landowners, those of us who own land, whether it's just our little house, suburban house, or it might be a farm, or it may be a larger tract of land or a commercial piece of land if we have a business, we are responsible for how that land is used and what it does in terms of either contributing or taking away from the environment. The few protected pieces of land, the public lands and preserves, again, as Jean's already mentioned, they are somewhat fragmented. There's not that much of them left. You can do the math. And they're no longer enough. If you think of ecosystem services and what we need from the land, those little preserves can't provide everything that we need. And this is a little bit of the kind of caricature, but it's also sadly true. We've taken all that land and made most of it pretty unnatural because seems like the vision of most people up to this time have been, this kind of a nice house on a really large expanse of carefully manicured green lawn with a few specimen trees and maybe a little garden. So 45% of this land that people own, that we humans own, is the urban suburban matrix. And that's where most of us live. About 40% is in agriculture. And we're not done. I mean, the population in this country is still growing, and every year another 2 million acres is developed. And that's an area 2/3 the size of Connecticut. And on top of just the land ownership, we need roads to connect our towns and villages and businesses. We've planted a lot of this lawn, and we've replaced those native plants with the plants that we bring in, which for the last 2 centuries has been predominantly non-natives, a long English tradition, which they brought over with them. And this is a problem, again, a term that I will even go further than Jean did and say these lawns are deadscapes. They literally support nothing. Sometimes I wonder why people don't just go out and buy AstroTurf. It would be cheaper. The amount of money and environmental kind of bad things that are put into lawns. I think everybody probably in this room, I'm preaching to the choir, but it's rather staggering when you actually see what that's doing. And actually nowadays, even in a town that has a relatively rural character, like many of the towns in this northeast corner, in contrast to where I live on the coast, which feels like it's much more developed, there's the primary sources of pollution are still us. It is the fertilizers and pesticides we put on lawns, on golf courses, on schoolyards, on all our other developed spaces. It is also from agricultural use. And these are really the sources of the pollutants going into our waterways. And also costing a lot of money, not to mention gasoline for the machines we use to take care of this stuff, whether it's mowing it or blowing the leaves off of it. All of which, from my point of view, are not good and hopefully unnecessary if you do rethink your lawn. In fact, the grasses, we think, but grasses are plants, aren't they doing photosynthesis and aren't they absorbing water? Well, it turns out turf grass is actually pretty bad at doing a lot of those things. Yes, they do take some sunlight and convert it to energy, but since nothing eats them, that energy gets stuck there. It's just cut by a mower and then bagged and taken to the dump, right? In many cases. The turf grasses form shallow rooted mats. They actually don't absorb water very well, so they actually increase runoff over many other types of surface, land surface. And they require, as we mentioned, high inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and water to be maintained. Next slide. And then just to reiterate, what's left of nature is not enough. These remnants or fragments, little islands, if you will, of natural space are not enough to preserve biodiversity, let alone provide the ecosystem services that we need. What happens is that even the animals cannot move between these spaces. You know, the ones that most easily come to mind would be the slow moving land animals like turtles, you know, who would be either killed or wouldn't even venture across the roads and sort of unfriendly pavements to try to cross from one area to another. But you might be surprised to learn there are even insects, flying insects, that don't go very far. They're really home buddies. There are some butterflies and many of our native bees that won't venture more than a few hundred yards from when they're aboard. So they must find all of their forage, their nesting sites, everything they need to survive in a relatively small local space. And if you take away their forage, if you take away their nesting sites, then, well, they're not going to be there. They will be extirpated in that habitat. So that's where also loss of connectivity makes it impossible for them to really maintain themselves in an area if they're just these isolated dots. And local extinctions are usually a kind of prelude to a larger, you know, you could end up with a global extinction. You first start by extinguishing the species in little spots, and as more and more spots, I mean, it kind of makes sense. A friend of mine in CT NOFA, Dina Brewster, actually introduced me to this analogy. She thinks of biodiversity and ecosystem like a Jenga tower, and each of the blocks is another species of animal or plant. And the question is, how many of these can you remove? How many of these need to go extinct before the whole tower collapses? And that, to me, that is a good sort of way of imagining, you know, what's happening to the world. You know, we're slowly pulling out these blocks with the declines we're seeing in different types of native plants and animals. And so it's really important that we try to reverse this process before it's too late. Next slide. I'm losing my cursor here. Okay, and then we have seen warning signs over the last few decades, and maybe even within the last decade in particular. Research has shown that we are losing species pretty much in proportion to the habitat that is lost. So if we only have 5% left of natural habitat, then if we don't do anything about it, that means we're only going to be supporting about 5% of its original biodiversity in the long run. So state national heritage centers, which are the bodies that track our native species, have estimated that as many as 33,000 species of plants and animals in the US are now too rare to perform their role in their ecosystems. So they're already functionally extinct. They're hanging on by a thread, but there's so few of them, they're really no longer able to do what they should be doing to support the other organisms and the ecosystem as a whole. And then recent surveys have, you know, further substantiated these declines. And, you know, rather than even throw numbers at you, I mean, I think something that made me sort of stepped back and was a little sobering was, you know, how many of you remember, you know, growing up, driving on a summer evening and, you know, getting your windshield all spattered with bugs? Does that happen nowadays? I think, you know, we all sort of realize, oh yeah, not so much. And that's pretty, actually, that's pretty striking when you think about it. You can be driving through the same kind of fields and rural feeling areas, but all of a sudden, you know, something's missing. And similarly with the birds, and this has actually been documented, I think, in a report that came out in 2018, that there are a lot fewer birds in the US. And a lot of that is not necessarily only what happens here, because these are migrating, they spend their winters in the neotropics. So, you know, they're getting hit all along the different locations. They live for different parts of their lives. But it's worrying. It tells us, you know, there's something wrong going on here. And then similarly, you know, other studies documenting, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say insect apocalypse, but it is very worrisome. You know, in Europe, German studies have shown that, you know, their insects have declined, that 46 species of their butterflies and moths have disappeared. And not only the numbers of species, but if you look at the overall abundance of insects, just the total number has declined almost 50% in the last half a century. And why is this all important? Well, it comes back to, you know, something I've sort of touched upon, is that we all depend on nature for the ecosystem services it provides: air, water, healthy soils to grow our food, for the habitat, for the vegetation, forests and marshes, to serve to buffer extreme weather events, to prevent the extreme, to cool, you know, during the summer heat, provide shade. We need our pollinators to pollinate our food crops, not only the other flowering plants. And we need all of these organisms in the ecosystem to help recycle the waste, dead animals, dead plants. You know, we need it all to get reused. It's not a one-way street. And the ecosystems that determine the carrying capacity, you know, how much of all of us who can live on Earth and be sustained over time, requires biodiversity. It requires, if you depend too much on one thing, again, I think intuitively people realize it's not a good thing, and some really good examples are, for example, like the Irish potato famine, when our agriculture becomes too dependent on not only one crop, but one cultivar of one crop, and a disease comes in, whoosh, everything is gone. And when you don't have biodiversity to provide that reserve of some organisms being able to survive better under one condition and some under another, you will get nothing to carry us through if the wrong convergence of catastrophes or extreme weather or whatever occur. So we need that diversity to make sure that something, there's an escape hatch. And this biodiversity is ultimately sustained by plants, because they're at the bottom of the food pyramids. They're really the bottom layer of our ecosystem. And to go into a little more about how they do provide this biodiversity, well, plants, as you may have learned in school, they take sunlight and they take water, and they make the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and they can make molecules like sugars, carbohydrates out of them. And so they make more plants, basically. And that is the first conversion of that chemical energy into living tissue. And then that energy moves through the ecosystem, through the food web, by feeding then things that eat plants. Largely that's insects, although we also think of rabbits and deer and such, but the predominant herbivores actually are insects. So insects are critical for now taking that energy and then feeding a whole lot of other organisms, and to specifically animals that don't eat plants, including our birds, including mammals, including amphibians and reptiles, but even some animals that you might not normally think of depend wholly in part on insects for food. Possums, for example, or even fox eat some insects as parts of their diet. And as we'll talk about more, birds, even the ones we think of as seed eaters or hummingbirds, they need insects. So many animals depend on insects for food that if we remove the insects from the ecosystem, it would just completely collapse. So, and if you've listened to Doug Tallamy's talks, I apologize. The next several slides I borrowed from what he has published, but I think it's really compelling and it's true. So birds, even as I mentioned, even the seed eaters feed their young almost exclusively on insects and specifically on caterpillars. And why is that? Well, it's really good. It's superfood for babies. They're nice, soft, squishy packages full of protein. None of that hard stuff like, beetles have. And, it's just very efficient for a bird to collect caterpillars to bring back to the nest and feed its young. High in protein, high in lipids. It's really nutritious. And it's also a source of important chemical molecules called carotenoids. These are things that often give color. So we think of carotenoids like what makes carrots orange or beets red or whatever. So these pigment colors are also very important to the birds. That's how they get their breeding plumage. They can't make these molecules on their own. They have to ingest them, and then inside their bodies, a little more chemistry happens, and then they get the colors that go into their seasonal feathers, amongst other things. Oops. Okay, so, and they need lots of caterpillars. So a pair of chickadees, one pair of chickadees brings many hundreds of caterpillars to its nest every day. And yes, there was a graduate student somewhere, either sitting in front of a nest or with the camera and then monitoring the footage of that camera over the whole day for all the days until those chicks fledged.
That was another part of our dinner conversation.
Yes, to catch caterpillars, but somebody earned their degree doing it, and they documented. And this is not true only for chickadees; it's true for almost every other songbird, with the exception of hawks and maybe pigeons. Most birds, over 90% of our birds, require insects to raise their young. So anyhow, these are the fun numbers. Okay, and so next step, what are the plants that make caterpillars? Well, native plants, okay, but even amongst native plants, we have certain champions. And just for the contrast, so this is an observational bit of work that Doug Tallamy did, but then he went and did some more rigorous searching. It is consistent with what's reported in the literature. So, but I think it brings the message home. So basically, he found some comparably sized trees of different types, native and non-native, and his students, I think what they actually did is they didn't just walk around the tree. I think they took like a leaf blower and they blew all the insects out of the tree onto some tarps underneath, and then they counted them. So that was their methodology. So there are all kinds of weird things that scientists do, but it allowed them to say, wow, we found 410 caterpillars out of 19 species in this oak tree. And if they did this now to a Bradford pear, one of our most common but non-native street trees that is planted, they found exactly one caterpillar. Of course, one caterpillar means only one species. And this pattern is not unique. It's really quite consistent when you look at a lot of different native trees versus non-native, and including the invasives here as my example. So euonymus, the burning bush that is so popular, such as popular landscaping plant. The burning bushes produced only 4 caterpillars of a single species, whereas a native black cherry produced, again, hundreds of caterpillars of 14 different species. So you kind of get the idea. And even when there are native and non-native members of the same genus or family of plants, for example, we have a beautiful native flowering dogwood, Cornus florida, but another very popular dogwood that people plant is the Korean Kausa dogwood, or Korean or Japanese. It's an Asian dogwood. And they're pretty similar in terms of their landscaping function. They're small trees, beautiful white flowers in the spring, red fruits in the fall. But the difference is the native dogwood supports well over 100 species of caterpillars. It supports birds. It turns out the dogwood fruits are very high in fat, which is just what migrating birds need in the fall. So they need to fill up on dogwood berries, not native dogwood berries. And in fact, most of them won't even eat the Kausa berries. Kausa berries are food for monkeys in their native country. But we don't have native monkeys here. And occasionally, while people have said, occasionally reported animals eating the cows or fruits, there's also the phenomena of if you're hungry, you eat what's available. If there's nothing but if you live in a food desert and there's a 7-Eleven down the street, well, you go down there and you get a hot dog and a big gulp. You know, it fills the belly, but it's not exactly good nutrition. So, and if you'll pardon me, I'm going to be a science geek and show you just a little more data, but very quickly and hopefully just to make some simple points. So again, actual research has corroborated that you do get a greater diversity of these herbivorous insects on native woody plants than on non-natives, 3 times as many on average. Next slide. And whoops.
I got a black one.
Oh, no. Oh, well, there's supposed to be a tall bar on the left and a short bar on the right, showing you that the native plants produce more caterpillars by weight. So if you think of Ptolemy blowing all the caterpillars out of a tree, if you put them in a bowl and put them on a scale, they would weigh 35 times more than the caterpillars he was able to harvest out of a non-native tree. And if you did that, again, repeated it many times with many different natives and non-natives and got the statistics, this would still hold. And finally, you could say, well, there are cases where our native insects do seem to forage or feed on non-native species. Can't they substitute, at least in some cases? And there are exceptions to every rule. So I won't say this is never the case, but if you take what are called generalist insects, which means they'll eat almost anything, maybe a grasshopper or I don't know exactly what, but certain types of caterpillars that have much more cosmopolitan appetites, they can be raised, in a laboratory or in an enclosure on a diet of pure non-native plants and compared to the ones that feed on their normal hosts. But what you see is that they grow bigger and faster on the native plants. Clearly, there is a nutritional difference. It's a better diet. They are evolved to forage on the natives. And I'm sorry that these are not showing exactly the same thing.
Well, they don't know what you're seeing.
Yeah,
I
okay.
do.
I have another graph. Sorry, that I apologize. This is one of the little glitches that we have. That's why the PDF I thought might
Okay.
have gotten around some of these problems. Oh well, lessons for next time. Okay, well, that's all right. I think the point gets across. In all those different dimensions, the natives are supporting more different kinds and just more abundance of insects than non-native plants. So if you can just imagine, think of your garden of native plants as, analogy of your vegetable garden. How productive is it? How many caterpillars is it producing? Well, if you're planting natives, you're going to produce a whole lot more caterpillars for the birds and all the other herbivores in the ecosystem. And you may ask, well, why is it that the non-natives just aren't able to do this? Oftentimes they look really similar to our native plants. What's different? Turns out it's what you can't see. It's chemistry and it's this evolution, because plants don't really, they don't want to be eaten. They want to grow as plants. So they develop these chemical defenses to prevent insects from eating them. But the insects are also evolving and they are evolving to be able to eat the plants. So it's a kind of a chemical arms race in a way. Think of the monarch butterfly and milkweed. Most of you know that monarchs are able to eat milkweed, even though it's toxic to many other insects and to birds, etc. Well, even to a monarch, when the female monarch looks for a place to lay her eggs, she is both finding the milkweed, but also detecting the amounts of certain chemical molecules that milkweed is making to figure out which plants she should lay her eggs on. Because at certain stages of development, they might be too toxic. There are cases where the monarch eggs will hatch and the caterpillars will die because those plants were making too much of the toxic compound. As we say in the pharmaceutical industry, poison is in the dose. You have to have the right dose of something and it's good for you. Too much of it, it's not good for you. Too much of anything. Too much aspirin, too much salt, even too much water. So it's this balance, and it's the co-evolution of organisms in the ecosystem that really develop the ties between them, that make them so interdependent, but also make them work together so well. And again, the monarch is a good example of this. In some cases, the insects even repurpose the plant's chemicals. So monarch caterpillars take some of those toxic chemicals, hopefully in doses so low enough that they don't make them sick, but they convert them into the molecules that make the monarch caterpillar toxic to the birds, so the birds won't eat them. And so this is all part of the way the system works, and it keeps everything in balance. So again, going back to it's kind of how we say things. It's not just native versus non-native. It's because the natives are more ecologically productive. And what we want are ecologically productive plants in our landscape, not those that don't produce anything or that just sort of bottle up all the energy and don't give it away. And then even amongst native plants, as we said, there are different rankings. About 5% of species make 75% of the food that drives the food webs. And these are the ones we call keystone plants. And please, it's not to give the message that you should only plant keystone plants. We need a diversity of native plants, but it is good to remember that some pull more of their weight than others. So these are really important plants to have around, but it's not only these plants. We then need to add to them a whole host of others. So we have the richness and diversity of native plants in our ecosystem. But to show you what some of these keystone plants are and to just reinforce, what we mean by the fact that they are able to support a much greater diversity of species, both of caterpillars. We use caterpillars as the example, again, because of their central importance to all the food webs, but also if you're a beekeeper or you're interested in bees and pollinators, we have over 350 different species of native bees in Connecticut. Honeybees are not native. They are farm animals. It doesn't mean they're not important, but that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking native bees. And so the honeybees are non-native and they're also generalists. So they forage on lots of different kinds of flowers. We have some specialist bees. In particular, one might think of early spring bees. There's some that live in the ground. They come out rather early in the spring and they're solitary. So they don't form big hives or colonies, but they still come out and they have to forage. They have to lay their eggs, provide some food for their larvae. And this whole life cycle happens oftentimes in a shorter period. They're kind of like, annual plants grow really fast. We grow fast, die young, etc. These bees live out their life cycles within a short season, and they are only able to feed on certain types of plants that bloom in their season. And again, in some cases, they've co-evolved for these reasons of the chemistry that I talked about, of shared chemistry, that even for those things that are flowering in their season, there's only a subset of those plants they use. For example, there are some specialist mining bees that only use some of our spring wildflowers like spring beauties, and which are already pretty uncommon. So you can imagine these bees are pretty uncommon. They can only live where spring beauties bloom. There is a type of butterfly called a Baltimore checker spot that primarily feeds on white turtle heads, our native white turtle heads. And these are not strong flyers either. So these are butterflies that, again, don't venture more than a few hundred yards away from where they were born. And they want to find their food and lay their eggs, and their caterpillars must find the food to eat, all in that, small home space. So, and then most of the keystone species are trees, but not all. Whoops, let's go back and finish looking at that slide. So there are some groups of wildflowers which are really good for pollinator gardens. So I'll mention them here that you'll want to have. Things like the goldenrods and asters, true sunflowers, helianthus, the coneflowers, coreopsis. These all feed many, many different species. They feed them at an important time of year. Coreopsis and coneflowers through the spring and summer, and then the goldenrods and asters summer into fall. And if you can imagine too, there are many species within these groups, and the more species you plant, the more bloom coverage you have throughout the season, because one species might only flower for 2 weeks. But if you have 6 different types of goldenrod, you'll have goldenrod in bloom from August through October. can. And then another distinction that's often made between natives and non-natives, particularly if we think about the perennial plants. The natives have evolved to be very deep-rooted, which may be a little counterintuitive because we're not necessarily talking prairies here. We're talking New England with its rocky ledges and thin soils. But many of our native plants are still able to deal with this by threading their roots in and amongst this crappy substrate we have and subsist in very infertile places. In fact, one of the reasons for their success is this. And in fact, when the non-natives come in or when we pour too many fertilizers on our land, we are encouraging those species that are not so well adapted to live in lean times by giving them so much food. And under those conditions, those often invasive plants will outcompete the natives. But left to their own devices in natural landscapes, these natives do very well. And their roots help to prevent erosion. So therefore, they manage water much more effectively by helping it infiltrate. And also their roots, so there's a whole community underground as well as above ground. And it's full of little critters that are hard to see, fungi and bacteria. And we may be more familiar thinking of this with plants like peas. We know peas can fix nitrogen because they have a bacteria that lives on their roots that helps them to do that. Well, it turns out it's not so unique. Many, many plants, trees in particular, form communities with the microbial organisms that live underground and even with each other's roots. And they trade nutrients and they trade things and they support each other. And so non-natives don't do this. They don't know how to speak the language or they don't know how to communicate with the native microflora and microfauna. So again, hopefully not beating the dead horse, gardens need to be more than pretty. We need to raise the landscape. We need to raise the bar for what we ask our landscapes to do so that in addition to providing, an aesthetic component to our homes, they move energy through the ecosystem, they sequester carbon. As I said, they take carbon and sunlight and water and they put it into leaves and stems and wood. They clean and manage watersheds. They enrich the soil. So again, when they die and their nutrients are recycled, they support the pollinators. In fact, we have pollinators because we have flowering plants. Before flowering plants evolved, there was no need for pollinators. And they provide this resilience against climate change and just make our environments not only more beautiful, but more bearable through providing shade, through breaking wind, through, again, protecting us against storms. And as I've said before, we really need to plant a diversity of native plants, not planting just one type. That doesn't really achieve the goal. You need the biodiversity. And when we create these complex landscapes with many different kinds of native plants and feed the wildlife through the season, that's when we're really sustaining biological diversity. Going back a little, so I mentioned that a lot of our pollinators are specialists. The ones that are generalists, probably the best known of these are the bumblebees, the common eastern bumblebee. One reason is because they have such a long life cycle and because they do form colonies and they've got to survive through the whole season. The queens are just emerging now. They have hibernated in an underground all winter. So they need food now to begin creating a new colony. And then their whole complex and fascinating life cycle will take them all the way to the fall when not that queen, but her daughters will need to prepare for hibernation so they can survive the next winter. So they are generalists because they need to eat all season long. So they've got to logically be able to feed on many different kinds of flowers. But that's an example of the other extreme. And they're also very important pollinators. So, and this is actually a slide borrowed from one of the original pollinator pathway presentations. So this idea that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. If we start connecting our natural landscapes, these little fragments that we've preserved and we've got left, if we connect them, we don't have to make everything native, but if we have corridors, so this is the value of the pollinator pathway in creating a map to know where you need to create the connections, then you allow animals and even the plants. Think of seed dispersal. Usually, very often, if it's not the wind, animals are the vectors of seed dispersal. They've got to be able to move from one fragment to another, and that's how the plants spread. So it's not just the animals moving, but they're also helping to spread the plants back and forth. And so if we create these corridors, we let them all connect one to another, as well as we connect ourselves to them. So as I said, part of this again is sort of reshaping our general thinking to recognize that the biosphere doesn't belong to us. I think Western civilization, if I may say so, has been long based on kind of a philosophy of dominance. We go out and conquer, and we dominate, whether it's another people, another frontier, you know, a wilderness. But I think now that we've been so successful doing that, we need to step back and realize that it doesn't belong to us, we also belong to it. And we also need to think of nature as not being over there, not the place we vacation or just go where when we want to relax, but we have to welcome it into where we live, because there's a lot more of us now and a lot more of the land that we own. So it's not too late to do this, to make this shift, but it is important that we do this and that we do it soon. And the one step I'm encouraging everybody to take, and that the purpose of this meeting tonight, is to ask you to add more native plants to your landscapes. And again, it's really like to think of it as a win-win. It's not only about being altruistic. I mean, although our own survival doesn't seem that altruistic, but thinking of our children and grandchildren, maybe just not, you know, us tomorrow. But we can also make native plant gardens that are beautiful. And they are, as Jean mentioned, if done right, they can be low maintenance or lower maintenance. They don't need the high inputs. And it's really about just, in some ways, it's a principle of any kind of gardening, but maybe, again, even to a greater extent, it's true with native plants, that if you put the right plant in the right place, put it in the right growing conditions, put it in companionship with the other native plants it's accustomed to growing with to form a plant community, then it'll take care of itself. And these native plants, again, is healthier for people with fewer pesticides and other, you know, the need to put any kind of other toxins into the environment, supports biodiversity, conserves our water, and it gives us a sense of place. I mean, who doesn't think of fall foliage in New England? And that's our native plants. Who doesn't think of certain flowers in the springtime that you may see in the woods? You know, it really gives us a kinship with where we live. You know, you can go anywhere and, you know, see an introduced plant. These artificial environments, it's like going, you know, to Europe and going to a McDonald's. Do we really want to do that? I think when we travel, we want to see what's native someplace else and see that their sense of place, their provenance. But I think we also appreciate that when we have our own. So, and as I said, these gardens can be done well. I mean, a habitat garden can be anything from a very naturalized meadow to be quite a formal designed landscape. It just uses the native plants. And it doesn't have to be all native to achieve the goal of supporting ecosystems, again, without going into the science. The sort of very rough back of the napkin calculations have said, if you have about 2/3, 70% of the total plants on your landscape are native, that's good. You know, the rest can be ornaments. And if you think of them as ornaments, just like the other non-living ornaments you may buy to pretty up your property, yeah, that's fine. If you have a gorgeous rose or a beautiful ornamental plant that you love and that, you know, gives you joy, you can have that. Just also make some space for natives. And when you do plant natives, don't just plant one of this and one of that. As I said, you want to create a functioning ecosystem. So many of the pollinators, when they're feeding on a particular type of plant in bloom, they really get focused on it. This is my topic of the day. When they're foraging, they will try to visit as many of that plant as they can. And so it's important to have enough, a sufficient amount of a certain type of plant. And so plant in drifts, plant in multiples, or, repeat that plants kind of throughout your landscape, which is also a good principle of landscape design. Make sure you understand how big the plants will eventually get. I have heard from, there are different philosophies. There are some designers who say, well, to make sure to reduce your weeding problem and also to basically just give you a garden that looks like a garden more quickly, you can crowd your plants a little more initially, but then you just need to be aware that you may have to thin them or that eventually some will die as they get crowded out as the other plants reach mature size. So that again, I think is a principle of all gardens, but in particular native gardens. They're not static, they evolve, they change. That change is beautiful, but you need to kind of accept it and work with it and not expect it's got to look tomorrow exactly as it did yesterday. But you can make it look intentional, little things like, again, having particular ornaments, having maybe a certain amount of hardscape features, a clean edge. You don't want to have a whole mowed lawn, but if you mow a few paths or an edging to your meadow area or your perennial bed, it'll give it an intentional look and it won't look unkept. Hopefully it'll keep the weed police away from your door. So now getting back a little bit to the organization that I've gotten involved with called Wild Ones. So we're about helping people learn how to landscape with natives. One of the new features they have on their website now is about native garden design to give you both some guiding principles about how to approach this. A little at a time, it can seem daunting. Some people tell me, I want to tear out my whole lawn. I want to convert my whole yard into natives. And I think that's great. But to be realistic, you may want to do it a little piece at a time, unless you've got a lot of money. So yes, you can do it in a modular way. So Wild Ones has, in fact, they got a grant, I think it was just last year, where they hired a bunch of landscape designers that are good at working with native plants, and they created model designs for kind of residential homes, actual homes. So these were real plants for real places, but ones that were interesting enough and that they thought could be sort of serve as an inspiration for many people who would live in that particular area. So they've got about, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 of these now on their website, and you can look at the designs and see if anything looks similar or, that you might want to adapt. They even have some interviews with the landscape designers as webinars. So if you want to find out, how did they think about it? How did they approach it? You can learn from them in that way. And I think that's a really nice resource. So Wild Ones, while it's a national organization, it works through local chapters like ours. It started out in Wisconsin in the Midwest in the 1990s, but has since spread to, I think now cover about 27 states, most east of the Rockies, which is good in a way because there are things we share about our different ecoregions that are more similar than the stuff west of the Rockies. But that being said, it's really at the very local level that we learn how to grow our own native plants. What's the right thing to grow? Where do we find them? Where can we buy them? But at the national level, the organization is supporting its chapters with some general webinars. People like Doug Tallamy or Heather Holm, who's published a number of really nice guides if you want to learn how to identify the bees and wasps and other pollinators. I've got a couple of her books there for you if you want to leaf through them. She's another honorary director of Wild Ones and has recorded some webinars for them. There is a national grant program called Seeds for Education. They're small grants, up to $500, but to help school groups, the requirement being it has to involve young people. It's our way of trying to get the next generation to learn about, appreciate, and growing native plants. So any projects that involve young people in actually creating a native plant garden is eligible, and the monies from Wild Ones will help them to buy the seeds and plants. There is a journal that is published quarterly. It is now in electronic form only to be more sustainable. And it is relatively restricted to members. I think sometimes, like many publications, they'll like give you a teaser issue that's public, but if you want access to the whole archive of journals, you do need to become a member. And they have a private Facebook group, which is moderated by a number of experts from different regions. So if you have plant questions or you just want to connect with other members in your region, that is a platform for doing so. So that's a little bit about how Wild Ones works at the national level. As I say, we as a local chapter, we have monthly meetings. We're based in Southeastern Connecticut, sponsored by Connecticut College Arboretum, which has a very strong environmental focus and a very good native plant collection. So it kind of became a logical partnership. And in fact, it grew out of the work of Dr. Bill Nearing, who is one of the past directors of the Arboretum and has become quite well known for his environmental work. He was instrumental in getting an appreciation for wetlands, not as wastelands, but as important habitats that preserve our environmental quality and deserve protection and not to be simply filled in and developed. So on this last couple of slides, I have some resources for growing native plants. As I say, this is part of the work our local chapter does, is to try to provide these sources of information to people who want to grow natives. So whether you are looking for a plant finder to help you find the plants that will grow under your conditions, be they shady or sunny or clay or sand, you can go to Audubon Society, actually, as well as National Wildlife Federation, both have these zip code based plant finders. So no matter where you live, they've got information that is tailor-made to your region. And in addition, they try to provide some ancillary information on the animal species. Obviously, Audubon focuses on the birds. National Wildlife also focuses more on the insects, the butterflies and moths that will use a particular native plant. So if you're interested in attracting certain types of insects in particular, say you love swallowtails or you love a certain other kind of butterfly, you can find out which plants you should have to make sure you're providing for their caterpillars. Seed sources. So this has been a real challenge, seed and plant sources. There are not a lot of dedicated native plant nurseries that grow anything but cultivars, because cultivars, while they started from native plants, they are specific selections, or in some cases, hybrids that were bred by people for people, usually for traits of ornamental significance or landscaping use, to find either a more compact, like a dwarf form, or maybe a prostrate plant where there isn't room for some big tall one. So unfortunately, it's not that plant breeding is in itself bad. It's the fact that it's never taken into consideration the ecological value of these plants. So horticulture, if horticulture can shift to preserving those features when they do their breeding, then it wouldn't be so bad. But for right now, that's something one has to be aware of. So those nurseries that focus on straight species for conservation restoration purposes are Prairie Moon Nursery, Ernest Conservation Seed. The Wild Seed Project is in New England. It's up in the southern coast of Maine. It's also a not-for-profit, but they do sell, I think it's mostly seeds rather than plants. Earth Tones Native Plant Nursery in Woodbury is a really good source here in Connecticut. The Native Plant Trust, actually for you guys, you're almost close to Massachusetts. So there is a Native Plant Trust, which is both got growing facilities in, their botanical garden is in Framingham, and the Sami Farm, which is mainly their growing nursery, is somewhere in central Massachusetts. But you can order plants online and pick them up at their nurseries. And I think it's on the last slide. Well, then there are other organizations. So Rhode Island has a fantastic Wild Plant Society. And I'm sure that with these slides can be emailed or made available to people. So that way you don't have to copy paste the hyperlinks. And I'd be happy to, send out a list and Jean can share them with everybody.
The Woodstock Conservation Commission has a website and I will be putting the links on the website. We'll make sure that happens.
And, okay, this is the more where to buy. And since springtime is one of the main planting seasons, there are some seasonal native plant sales. In fact, I think Jean has some information here. This is what the last night to order
Yeah.
from the Eastern Conservation.
Eastern Connecticut
Conservation
Conservation District. We
Districts.
have an annual plant sale this year. We went native, although we have a mixture of native straight species and cultivars. If you get your order in to me tonight, you have your checkbook with you, I'll get you in. The actual closing date was on 2 days ago, but we're written a special extension.
Yeah. So, but for future reference, it's a great way to support your conservation districts. And I think every year they're getting better and better with offering more native plants in their plant sales. But most of them finish up sometime in early April. But not to worry, there are more coming up. You may have to drive a little bit. This Rhode Island Wild Plant Society hosts some really spectacular spring plant sales. The members grow most of the plants themselves from local ecotype plant seed sources. So if you go to their website, I believe they actually have 2 spring sales. One focuses more on the early season species, and that's coming up on Mother's Day or Mother's Day weekend. I can't remember if it's a Saturday or Sunday. And it's part of a larger festival. So it's kind of like a one-stop shop where you can get your vegetable seedlings. It's like there's with a farmer's market and a couple of other vendors. So you get your native plants, you can get everything. And it's a very fun event. But seriously, they have very good plants. And then they do a second late spring plant sale in June where they sell most of their later season species. That's where you get a lot of your summer and fall blooming perennials and also some other woody species. And then the Aspetuck Land Trust, which is at the other corner of the state from here. They're in Fairfield County, but they do a really good native plant sale. They have actually been working with Connecticut Northeast Organic Farmers Association to start growing our own Connecticut grown Ecotype 59 native plants from seed that has been responsibly collected by some of the botanists. So they've really developed a great partnership between botanists and nursery growers and farmers who are starting to grow up larger quantities. So not only do the farmers get the benefit for their own vegetables of having all these pollinator plants, but the pollinator plant itself is becoming a cash crop. But it's all good. I mentioned Earth Tones and Native Plant Trust. And finally, for those of you so inclined, there is an Amazon of native plants called Izel Plants. And some IT people had the foresight to say, we need to aggregate all the sources of native plants and be able to target them back to the regions where they're appropriate. So again, zip code based, you go in, put in your zip code, and they'll tell you if they can find any particular native plant from an East Coast. So it's not going to be strictly New England, but it will be from an East Coast nursery. The advantage is you can buy from wholesalers through Izel. You can get whole flats, trays of plugs of a given plant type. So if you're doing a larger project, this is a wonderful source. You pay a slight markup, but frankly, it's the only way in some cases of getting these types of plants and in the quantities one might need.
I'll also mention that we have some local plant suppliers, and I am working with them to increase the amount of native plants they carry, but they do carry some native plants, and hopefully with supply and demand, if people demand it, they'll supply more. So ask about it next time you're at the local plant store.
Yes, that's really key. If you go there, if you as the customer go there and say, I'm looking for this, I don't want pesticide. I want you to be able to tell me these plants were not pesticide treated. I want you to be able to tell me they are, what's their provenance? Where do they come from? Did you buy them from somewhere in Kentucky or did you buy them more locally? I mean, not that Kentucky is bad, but there are cases actually more important where, perhaps the same type of tree that grows here, but if it was grown in Georgia or Florida, it may not thrive as well in our environment as something that was a little more locally grown. So, that's just kind of the common sense aspect to it. But even for native plants, one has to kind of think about it in that way. And I just have a couple more slides that are more just eye candy, but just to reiterate, this is the Pollinator Pathway Pledge. And if you plant it, they will come. You know, you will enjoy. These are all pictures taken either from my garden or within a mile or so of my house. I'm very lucky that I live on a greenway and that the Coogan Farm, which Jean mentioned, that's one of my community projects. I want to give back to them because they saved this land, 30 acres of a historic farm that otherwise would probably be another hotel, another, you know, set of condos or something. But instead, hopefully we have this greenway, we have paths, and some of it is utility right of way. It's not without its issues and its invasives, but it's a start and it's much better than what it might have been. And with that, I'll be very happy to take questions.
I'm going to stop the program.
If there are any questions. And I've got some
Yeah.
information about wild ones on the side table. As I said, we're based in southeastern Connecticut, but now we've got members really all over this state. If there's enough interest in any community and you feel like you're a little too far away from us, consider starting a